Hi, everybody. Before I begin, it's imperative, of course, that I mention, that I acknowledge that this conference paper is being given on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in what is known as Vancouver, British Columbia. I'd also like to acknowledge the unpaid and underpaid labor of everybody keeping these servers up and running on servers and platforms such as Zoom across the global south, from Bangladesh to Manila and Bangalore. And I'd like to thank Sepideh, Majidi, Paul Reynolds, and Conrad Hamilton for this super generous invitation to give a test run, my first test run on this material. So what I'm hoping to do is to offer a little bit of clarification by offering an account of what I think is ultimately at stake in Alfred Sohn Rethel's intellectual and manual labor through a reading of artists that precognize and prefigure, to use neologisms coined by Maurizio Lazzarato about what artworks do, precognize and prefigure what I think is at stake. And what is at stake is that Sohn Rethel offers, to my mind, the most convincing account of the emergence and development of a second nature that gets misrecognized in everyday life for an ontology. I don't think this contradicts the labor theory of value at all. I think, if anything, it's offering an account of why we can't recognize the labor theory of value. And that is the open secret of real abstraction, as Alberto Toscano would say. So in any case, without further ado, I should start my paper. So, in his authoritative study of Francis Picabia's oeuvre, art historian George Baker informs us that the title of this work, which I'm showing you here, dating from 1916, 1917, very auspicious date for us Marxists, comes from a phrase, quote, first popularized by Karl Marx, end quote. Baker attributes Picabia's choice of title to the artist's emotionally intimate relationship with Tristan Tzara, the poet most vocal in renouncing his anarchist politics, if not his anarcho-symbolist poetics, in favor of state-affiliated and party-affiliated communism by the 1930s, finally joining the French Communist Party in 1935. Tzara's migration across political spectrums of the left rested on his awareness that the tyranny of the market equaled, or indeed had already come to overcome that of the state in mediating individual and collective self-determination. On the face of it, Universal Prostitution looks like a machine part standing vertically against an undifferentiated field, hooked up to another machine part through a series of tubes and pipes and issuing words about the human body. It is utterly nonsensical from the vantage of description or representation. Marcel Duchamp, who had initiated what has been referred to first by Rosalind Krauss and then again by Maurizio Lazzarato as the theoretical object of the 20th century par excellence in the form of the ready-made, recognized the extraordinary ramifications of Picabia's formal and structural insights in the piece. He gifted Universal Prostitution to the Yale Museum of Art in 1924, which is where it hangs now. Needless to say, this is where I get the title of my work as well. Duchamp surely noted the artist's surprising mobilization of a new means of drawing, disarticulated from both mimetic representation and personal expression. The modality of lines specific to the diagram is drawn from science, technology, and industrial engineering, which introduced both a logic and a seeming ontology, which Duchamp signaled with the ready-made. Each artist got there by extrapolating a novel logic of form. And by there, I mean an acknowledgement of real abstraction in advance of and tracking parallel to the development of aesthetic abstraction only after 1920. You could think of Mondrian or a lot of continental artwork post-dating Picasso's Cubist insights. Central to the convictions of this argument, Duchamp saw that Picabia had arrived at a new course of articulation through his engagement with a Marxian understanding of abstraction. But to be clear, artists don't waste their time illustrating theory. They generate new idioms that only later came to be understood as paradigmatic to the avant-garde, not because the avant-garde was some kind of contest, but because Picabia, like Duchamp, found a way through which to convey an otherwise unlocatable and invisible, because fully saturated, omnipresent, seeming ontology of everyday life under that which had come to universalize, but which remained invisible, the moving totality of capital circulation, the unity of the labor, of the origin of value in labor and its realization on a market in the form of a commodity. This is to say that he hit on an index of a fully elaborated social technology yoked to the self-referential autonomy of the value form, its self-replicating circuits of capital production, and its attendant circuits of the reproduction of labor power. So in Marxian shorthand, this would be the MCM and CMC cycles, which I think are set into play here in ways that tease out the ramification of the theory of those circuits. Why isn't my presentation moving forward? Excuse me, I gotta fix this. This is such a drag. There. In 1915, Duchamp inaugurated a new species of art, which clearly recognized a social synthesis preceding both artist and artwork and determining the creative act. That synthesis expresses itself in the point of sale. Duchamp purchased a thing he then presented as an artwork. Up to then, an artwork was understood to be a repository of craft, skill, and beyond those disciplinary competences, some nominal unknown quotient we might call inspired creativity, the artist's agency, and that which they come to be known for. Having declared America, his newly elected home, to be the place of, quote, good plumbing, dentistry, and hardware shops, end quote, Duchamp replaced artisanal process and its supplementary creativity with the act of purchase. Tides of literature have explored this gesture as a mediation on the discursive and institutional framework of art, or as a form of modernist estrangement, or as mastery over the tyranny of the shop window. For now, we might think of it as a tacit acknowledgement, not so much of the foreclosure of the kind of creative agency first posited by the Jena Romantics, who elaborated the category of art as such. And of course, I also mean Hegel there, and Hegel's philosophy of fine art, which is more or less the beginning, the middle, and end of art history as a discursive discipline. But as a displacement of those problems onto the point of sale. The buy supplants both the intellectual and manual labor that the artwork traditionally held in tension. But if Duchamp relocated the genesis of the artwork from creativity or creation as such to production and market valorization, already a seismic gesture in 1915, he had yet to find a way to convey the extent to which a social totality recomposed by the unity of production and circulation might be crystallized in the transaction that made the ready-made available to view. And recall that the conveyance of a social totality had once been the purview of a work of art, according to Hegel and the Romantics. And as contemporary, the biggest art historian of the 20th century, I suppose, is still T.J. Clark. And he has argued throughout his work that The conveyance of a social totality is the purview of the work of art, especially of painting. So I offer an account of the motivation for Picabia's turn to the mechanomorph and to the diagram, the two paradigmatic tactics for which Picabia is most credited in the history of the avant-garde. Dada, Surrealism, and the Soviet avant-gardes all demonstrated a perfervid attachment to new forms of media and technology and to the iconography of machine parts. All three avant-gardes envisioned a new subject brought by these forms, yet also indebted to the way in which Marx had tried to describe a new historically emergent class, almost as though it were a new species, and that historically emergent class is, of course, proletariat. The Picabia's mobilization of the diagram is singularly attentive to the nodal position of this new species, this new split subject, forged in and as an abstraction, or what, following Adorno and Sohn Rethel both, we could call the second nature, the quote unquote second nature of abstraction. His gesture, as well as Duchamp's deference to it, suggest a way in which art mediates the relationship between political economy and aesthetics at a perceptual level, other to and in advance of political economic discourse. Dada predates Alfred Sohn Rethel's intellectual and manual labor by a half-century, performing in advance the key points that dissolve Kantian epistemic categories and see those categories as themselves a function of the market, determined by a social synthesis that takes place behind the backs of men, rather than within or because of their transcendental faculties. I have yet to address Picabia's title or what relation it might have to either machine parts or diagrams. My gambit is that the nature of exchange, the transactional trade of embodied labor time in return for currency, is the social synthesis formative of abstraction itself. That the metabolic transfer of value and the sale of labor power realized only on a market indifferent to qualities, substance, and social relations is the matrix of abstraction. The sale of labor power as a commodity is for Sohn Rethel the linchpin, distinguishing capitalist value production and capitalist labor from other kinds of labor that predate it. It is the sale which distinguishes the capitalist market from pre-capitalist markets. Sorry, that might have been unclear. The sale of labor power hidden in the commodity. This social abstraction founded on the division of the subject into labor power and the bearer of labor power valorized on a market and figured in the pre-capitalist prostitute is the condition for the possibility of the putative turn to technology. Social abstraction is itself the prefiguration of technology, objectified, externalized, and ultimately fixed in constant capital aimed at the displacement of labor that was its condition of possibility. Picabia's The Double World from 1919, a rejoinder to Duchamp's LHOOQ, which if you say it quickly in French, sounds like she's got a hot ass, imagines the subject as a diagram, technically still a kind of figure against a de-differentiated ground, and yet shattered and redistributed. While the thick curvilinear form connects the various terms bas, haute, fragile, and domicile, this formal recollection and negation of a traditional figure bends, twists, and moves like a trajectory over a territory. Looks like a map. It resembles a diagram of the subject as a process of movement rather than a static thing across a set of terms of the kind Jacques Lacan would eventually use to try and figure the subject as a function of a circuit among moments or stations, and the individual a mode of organizing the part objects that constitute it. The way that Picabia expresses this circuit is interesting insofar as it is the only consistent element in the work, which otherwise offers nothing but movement, abstracted and frozen into a two-dimensional approximation. Picabia's other mechanomorphs address the reification of the individual in relation to the productive technologies over which he is said to stand but which come to stand over him or her. These include a portrait of the photographer Alfred Stieglitz, who managed to make a photography which was otherwise dismissed as a kind of industrial machinic byproduct, who managed to make a photography in art form through his efforts to promote the mechanical medium in a variety of discursive frameworks in both his Gallery 291 and his magazine 391. In this, quote, portrait captioned here, "This is Stieglitz," here, which I show you, Picabia presented Stieglitz the man as a camera, as an object. The ostensibly skilled practitioner and his medium are set in this portrait into a strange, mutually constitutive indeterminacy as far as subject and object position are concerned. Similarly, in a piece entitled Mechanomorph, Portrait of a Young American Girl, Picabia offers the mimetic representation of another machine part, a tool. Under this represented thing, the words forever float, at once evoking the language of Eros while literalizing the non-organic nature of mechanically produced objects, which in turn find their use in the production line. I'll return to the young girl later. But Universal Prostitution sets the machine parts into a circuit. Here, Picabia found a device through which to articulate more expeditiously the inscription of the worker as a nodal moment along a set of circuits. That device is the diagram. In realism, rationalism, and surrealism, art between the wars, Bryony Fair, David Batchelor, and Paul Wood define the diagram as an index of facture, of artistic practice, and the temporality of an unfolding process. It has long been noted, with reference to constructivism and other practices of the early 20th century, that while the, quote, diagrammatic line is drawn from the realm of science and technical drawing, the final work has elements of notation, almost like a kind of musical notation. The work presentable, if that is taken model used in figure art, they contain allusions to the world in which they were produced by the currency of associations, materials, and methods, end quote. This new form imported into art displaces drawing as it had been understood throughout the longue durée of figurative European art, so from 1480 on. Beginning with Masaccio and then moving into the Renaissance, drawing had functioned as the cornerstone of a regime of representation, breaking the visual plenum into figure and ground and guaranteeing the integrity of a depicted body against the envelope of space. Long acting as the foundation of that normative aesthetic apparatus, and that normative aesthetic apparatus is, as far as I'm concerned, also a normative perceptual and cognitive apparatus. The capacity to produce and manipulate linear form had also, by the opening of the 20th century, come to be a vehicle of expressive capacity, notably in the Viennese and Central European context, in its debt to Romanticism. As art historian Molly Nesbitt convincingly argues in Their Common Sense, the Duchampian ready-made, Krauss's theoretical object, is a function of industrial design. Nesbitt notes that Duchamp's generation was the first to be taught mandatory drawing for design in the French public school system, ostensibly to train engineers and factory workers alike. Less noted, perhaps, is the degree to which the shift reverberates through the 20th century, across historically and geopolitically specific moments to render otherwise unfigurable and invisible, because total, shifts in the mediation between the real and its reception, or what were once called base and superstructure. The key here is the shift in the register within which line is expected to deliver meaning. Replacing contour and mimesis with notation, the transition at the heart of basic visual practice signals the de- and recomposition of content and meaning at a fundamental level. Perhaps not unlike the transition in the wake, the image underwent in the wake of technological reproducibility, as famously described by Walter Benjamin in the work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility. This would suggest that abstraction, or what is referred to as aesthetic abstraction, issues first from abstractions shaping the real movement of history. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The diagram is also often appropriated as a form of cognitive mapping. If in this context, the diagram could be said to map anything, because maps too are, of course, a form of representation and all too often a form of misrepresentation, it might be the process of subjectivization itself. It maps the process of subjectivization that precognizes, again, Lazarato's word for the ready-made operations, Jacques Rancière's claim in Reading Kapital that the subject's circuitous and mediated relation to the sale of labor power makes the question of the subject as a fixed identity or even a bounded and integrated figure utterly moot. Okay, so what I'm saying there is long before Lacan's theory of the subject as a provisional collection of the chaos of movements in a kind of circuit, which what I'm ultimately getting at is I think Lacan is wrong about that. And I think Sohn Rethel offers a better model of what a social unconscious is. But the point here is that Duchamp and Picabia are prefiguring that. So Girl Born Without a Mother, again, also by Picabia, poses the question, who or what is an agent in Kapital? A question Jacques Rancière later picks up in Reading Kapital. To frame the problem, he traces the movement toward formalization of what Marx calls, quote, universal prostitution in the Philosophic and Economic Manuscripts of 1844, by which Marx simply meant the generalized sale of labor power, fueling production, circulation, and consumption as moments to be mapped across the numerous functionally interrelated terms of the cycle of capitalist accumulation. These terms, related by and within the process of surplus value production and realization, only appear independent, or at best bearing an aleatory connection. Value, around which all social relations objectively reticulate, connects seemingly disconnected elements invisibly. This is to say that the diagram is not a description of a chance operation, as much literature has insisted. At no point does the aleatory replace intent as such, insofar as the totality of the system, far from accidental, is motivated by the very process of value realization itself. Postmodernism got the problem all wrong by setting intention against chance, rather than as against market determinism, which it mistook for freedom. In other words, Picabia and Duchamp and Picabia's practice challenge chance, that which is understood as purely aleatory events, as much as it challenges authorship. Building on Althusser's interrogation of capitalism's autonomy from and indifference to human social interest in Reading Kapital, Rancière offers a theory of the subject as both a vehicle to capital's self-replication, but also as the missing element. This is in debt to Althusser's absent cause. The missing element in a social structure necessary to capitalism. Quote, what determines the relation between the effects is the cause, the social relations of production, insofar as it is absent, end quote. Here, Rancière makes a requisite nod to Marx's term, the hidden abode of production. However, that which is hidden is not the origin of value so much as its agent or producer, namely the worker. Rancière introduces the following insight. This absent cause appears absent within the social field insofar as abstract labor and concrete labor are collapsed and confused. Those are two different and separate things. Quote, this generalized and abstracted misidentification expresses the structure of the capitalist mode of production, end quote. This absent cause is not work, but the way in which labor power, objectified, anonymous, and metricized, enters the social field disguised as the individual laborer who appears to operate as a friendly personification of the commodity labor power valorized on a job market. The worker is a split condition, caught in a glitch. Labor is presented socially in an anthropomorphic register that cannot but conflate the concrete labor bearer with her or his labor-bearing capacity, which in turn counts for nothing unless it is valorized on a labor market. And that's where I think the confusion comes in, that, oh, Sohn Rethel is occluding the labor theory of value. Not at all. I think his point simply is that that is as good as invisible unless it's realized, and that glitch is the source of social abstraction. Social relations in a social field expressed among people misses two primary moments that abstract the individual not only from his or her social context, but from him or herself. First, the abstract measure of labor time as much as second, its point of sale in the market. So both Postone and Sohn Rethel. Labor abstracted once as socially necessary labor time in the sphere of production, and then once again as the commodity labor power traded or realized at market, suspends the personal and collective experience of the bearer of labor power, replacing it with second nature naturalized along two circuits. And I think that's the answer to the question posed after the first session. Yeah, sure, we come, we buy, and we trade, we sell with intention, but that which is bought and sold is completely escapes the parameters of our understanding of the real. Rancière explains this glitch in the perception of labor caught in an interval where the bearer of labor power becomes confused with labor power itself as a skipped step between subject and object. This collapse might offer the beginnings of an insight as to why Marx first analogized the proletariat as universal prostitution in the Philosophic and Economic Manuscripts. It's a very eccentric way to characterize an emergent proletariat as universal prostitution. While individuals have always been subject to power, indeed, as Etienne Balibar notes, the word subject derives from subjection to a sovereign power. Capital is crucible of an internally riven subject forged to lubricate a new mode of production that is ultimately not reciprocally interested in their flourishing. So that's where the whole issue of intention is just utterly moot, right? Value is autonomous. Its realization is autonomous. So here's Rancière. The inversion of the inner structural determination appears as a fundamental characteristic of the process, end quote. In short, Rancière provides a theory of reification that nuances that of Lukács by moving the site of reification from object to subject, quote, subject. Key for this discussion is the way in which concrete and abstract labor are unified in the moment of exchange, to which I return. So the sheer number of artworks that turn away from representational logic and toward the operational aptitude of the diagram, not only by Duchamp and Picabia, but also in the context of the Soviet avant-garde and Italian futurism, mark 1915 through 1920 is a generative time in rethinking the very capacities of or affordances of artistic mark making. I take these artworks to be a form of thinking that prefigure the political, economic, and other discourses to follow. We might imagine that Lacan learned as much from his cohort among the surrealists as artists would later learn from Lacan, or I would argue Lacan's entire theory is coming out of his interlocutorship with the surrealists, and that his diagrammatic understanding of the subject as itself a network of circuits found some inspiration there. But again, Picabia, as Baker notes, titled his work to acknowledge debt to Marx. So it's Marx that is providing the model of the unconscious in the Dada work of Duchamp and Picabia. 1917 could be understood as a moment when the internal contradiction into which capital sets labor made itself most clear in the form of diagnostics in the cultural sphere, just as it marks the year in which a politics forged around the collective capacity of anonymous labor expressed itself most passionately. Revolutionary politics hoped to take Marx's ruthless critique of existing forces of production and apply it to collective life. Of course, I'm referring to the Grand Revolution of 1917. But in this, it realized the avant-garde's battle cry, quote, art into life. And it's no wonder that the first 5 years of revolutionary life under the Soviets took art so very seriously until the NEP comes and shuts all that down by the mid-1920s. The aesthetic conjuncture marked by Dada and the other avant-gardes merely echoes the degree to which aesthetic abstraction came to mediate mediation. The artwork mediates and resists the circuits of value and labor power as the only form of mediation to universalize, to modernize. So I'm saying there that capital and the value form is the only ultimately universalizing force capacity, and the artwork is trying to come to grips with this. In other words, it marks the moment when aesthetic abstraction emerged as a means of second-degree mediation of an already abstract situation. It surfaced as a signal and index, as opposed to reflection or representation of abstraction at the level of the real. The real abstraction wrecked by capital that Marx elaborates in the Grundrisse, against which he brackets off aesthetic abstraction. For those who don't care about art or culture, the stakes remain high enough. This unfolding of a cultural development is a clear articulation of the means, the perceptual cognitive grafting of the capitalist mode of production as it integrates itself into everyday forms, into forms of everyday life so operationally effective as to be invisible to all but the analytical lens of aesthetic praxis. So artists pay attention to what becomes completely saturated and naturalized to everyone else. Reciprocally, that new form of praxis, or the diagram as an artistic medium, affords ways of describing the real reordering of the world by the value form. While it would be impossible to map the one, the genealogy of the diagram, onto the other, the historicity of capitalist reintegration of global markets and forms resistant to it, a pattern common to both inquiries, both aesthetic abstraction and real abstraction, emerges. In the absence of any causal correlation, the transformation of line deterritorializes, and acts as indexically not unlike the de- and recomposition of the social field in line with the process of abstraction through the sale of the commodity labor power, indifferent to its bearer. So that returns to the question of intention. So what I'm doing here is just isolating a couple of such practices as an attempt to read them as indices, not illustrations of real abstraction. Picabia's jeune fille, his young girl from 1920, born of the interval between the revolution of 1917 and its compromise under the NEP, could be said to personify, to anthropomorphize both sides, the reification of and resistance to this condition of the abstracted subject. Personification is the wrong term, however, because there is no such thing as a subject within the circuitry of capital. Or rather, subjectivity as such is one moment of the circuitry of consumption and production necessitated by capital. And obviously here I'm kind of leaning more heavily on Grundrisse than capital. If we accept that the subject is the function of forms of subjugation and interpolation, as Marx argues at the beginning of Grundrisse, we might be ready to accept that any true subject as such is a complex battle against those forms of determination. And here I would defer to Badiou's theory of the subject, which I was dearly hoping would be a subtopic of conversation at this conference, but perhaps not. Otherwise, all subjects of capital might be personified in the classical sense of personification as Picabia's jeune fille. We're all the jeune fille, the young girl. Like the ready-made, that first cultural form mediating the all-consuming drive of the interval between the factory floor, currency, and social life, It indicates the subsumption in and of the expanded social field. A tool is a person a tool. And like Girl Born Without a Mother, it's not clear if this tool person is a machine part set to value productive work or an eroticized thing set to socially reproductive work. And that's a nod to the conversation around gender that will be taking place in days 2 and 3 of this conference. The condition of possibility for the reproduction of labor is nonetheless overcoded, fetishized, and sexualized to keep the system going. As to the young girl, she is acted as an exemplary figure, prefigurative of the ready-made, of modernity as such, insofar as Degas conjugated his careful classical depiction in bronze with a tulle skirt he bought at a department store. His portrait of the young girl, the little dancer of 14, which I'm showing you here from as early as 1881, presciently folds a market transaction into the very fabric of the artwork, which prior to the ready-made had all been about intention, creativity, artisanal skill, craft, yada, yada. Just as the ready-made and the diagram step in to indicate transactional social relations in the absence of any way to capture them in figurative representation, these forms might be understood as the incorporations of new technologies of social abstraction reticulated to market valorized labor power. Needless to say, capital is as indifferent to those who perform these stations along its circuitry as Degas' little dancer is to her viewer. And that's for those of you who know the work and know the reception of the work, Degas was excoriated and castigated for presenting a young girl with this kind of insouciant stance and expression of contemptuous indifference. And I think what he's trying to signal there is the indifference of this tidal wave of market power overcoming agency, creativity, creation, etc. So what I'm slowly getting at or trying to suggest is that these artworks indicate a social technology beneath the literal machine technology that offers a kind of answer to the putative question concerning technology, right, Heidegger's question, at the level of the self. And I think that's ultimately, as it was Adorno's interlocutor, I think that's also, Heidegger is also, or Heidegger's work is also a kind of hidden interlocutor in intellectual and manual labor. Another term for this technology of the social field and of a self recomposed to lubricate the market realization of labor power is real or concrete abstraction. But the question might be more specified by asking why aesthetic experience, bracketed off from the heteronomy of everyday life, should organize this question again and again across the century through the figure of the young girl and or the sex worker, right, the most common thematic trope of 20th century art, who has nothing but her proverbial skin in the game, nothing but her labor power understood in the most reductive sense to offer an exchange for her own daily replication. This figure comes to stand for a set of social relations that might be understood and objectified as a diagram. It stands for a social technology misrecognized as ontology, of living labor congealed into fixed capital as infrastructure by the mid 20th century, and misprized as technology, or misrecognized as technology as such. And this is the scandal in what Alberto Toscano calls the, quote, open secret of real abstraction. Marx's later notebooks in the Grundrisse investigate the process by which accumulated variable or living labor comes to be expressed as constant capital over time. Heidegger might as well have applied his analysis of that which is set to standing reserve, right? We all know the term set to standing reserve, right? Coming from Heidegger, I think it's common enough. He might have applied his analysis of that which is set to standing reserve to human social capacity rather than nature, and to think rather than nature, and to think of the bearer of labor power as that which is set to standing reserve in the double movement of production and reproduction set into motion along axes of circulation. Labor understood in this way is a technology subtending objectified technology. The Frankfurt School writers leaning most heavily or leaning most toward the Kantian pole of German idealism, Theodor Adorno and Alfred Sohn Rethel, have theorized this transformation of the subject within capitalist domination as the foundation of consciousness as such. They have understood it to be a function of the formation of second nature. This second nature is an abstraction that functions as though it were itself inevitable, the way things are. It is not that consciousness is false, nor does it come down to the way in which mankind, a category that cannot in any case be universalized in the final instance, despite capital's totalizing drive. It's not that mankind is alienated. Rather, it's that this fully naturalized reality is itself a product of the dominant metabolic mediating nature, however that is defined. Abstraction comes to saturate the field of the real and to be mistaken for it. As Sami Khatib has noted in his analysis of the autonomy of the value form in relation to both aesthetics and to a direly needed new theory of epistemology, quote, capitalism's physis produces its own naturally grown metaphysics, end quote. The mystification and anxiety around the so-called question of technology informs the strange silence around the question of real in distinction to aesthetic abstraction. And this is where Adorno and Sohn Rethel part ways. Adorno is quick to dismiss as technology that which closes the capacity for open exploration. He conjugates this understanding of technology with abstraction. Here is Adorno from lecture 8 of his lectures on negative dialectics from 1965, quote, as opposed to this intellectual experience as its counterpart, and by intellectual experience, he means negative dialect, the movement of thought through the negative. So, quote, as opposed to this intellectual experience as its counterpart, everything that can be described as the so-called controlled advance of abstraction, or as the mere subsumption under concepts, is merely technology in the broadest sense, end quote. So abstraction, like technology, is something to be dismissed. The avant-garde understood Marx much in advance of the academic, political, economic discourse of the pink-washed Cold War era and its aftermath. Through machining part objects set into the circuitry of relations conveyed through diagrams, Picabia prefigures the real-world abstraction of living or variable capital set to standing reserve in complex technological objects, that which Adorno dismisses as mere technology. Picabia's kind of thinking would later crystallize functionally in cybernetics. Cybernetics is the project of recreating the world through the infinite looping together of two moments, representation that separates and communication that binds. Picabia's diagrammatic rendering of part objects, subjects, related in a system of circuitry prefigures Norbert Wiener's systematic understanding of feedback, albeit on an imaginary plane. In the political discursive environment of Cold War McCarthyism, technology was either affirmatively lauded or contemptuously feared. As 20th century readers of the history of technology, Kuhn's reading entitled The Cybernetic Hypothesis draws primarily from Benjamin and Heidegger through Wiener and into thought on the nature of technological social control as theorized by Gilles Deleuze in his Postscript for a Society of Control. And it'll be clear why I'm seemingly digressing in a moment. I quote Kuhn's the Cybernetic Hypothesis, quote, whereas 1914 exacted its penalties for the decomposition of the anthropological conditions supporting the liberal hypothesis, the breakdown manifested in flesh and blood in the trenches of the idea of the individual and of any metaphysics of the subject, 1917 served as its historical contestation with the Bolshevik Revolution, end quote. But the real missing link in the discursive mediation is, I'm arguing, Sohn Rethel's intellectual and manual labor in which social synthesis is realized behind the backs of men in the transactional space of the market. What distinguishes this capitalist market from trade prior to the capitalist mode of production is the primary object for sale, the primary object that drives the totality, right, the unity of production and realization is the sale of labor power, or human energy becomes thing. This moment to which the totality of social relations are tethered is abstract insofar as space and time, insofar as the space and time of the market transaction negates both space and time, right? But the space and time, the origin of the commodity is irrelevant, just as it negates intention, or what we can call a shorthand, the bourgeois idea of free will and self-determination, because it is motivated by an autonomous logic, that of price, profit, and circulation. And yes, I recognize that price is often a misrepresentation of value, but again, the market doesn't care about that. It is even indifferent to both production and consumption, other than as these affect the relation between value and price. It cancels community and replaces it with community's capitalist unconscious. To emphasize, this unconscious space is not the space theorized by psychoanalysis. It is simply that which motivates any collective under capitalism despite their self-present intentions. The space of transaction is anonymous, impersonal, and impervious to the experiential, much less the conscious intentions of the buyer or seller. It forges an unconscious matrix impervious to will and reflective determination. Sohn Rethel locates in this space of transaction the first divide between intellectual and manual labor. This primary division has in turn determined epistemological categories going forward since the 6th century before the Common Era. The division cleaves human activity into reflective labor and manual production, which could include the agrarian, the industrial, etc., each of which require a different vector of mediated cognition with relation to the product. The space-time of transaction determines the social field unconsciously, and this synthesis becomes second nature, a metaphysics of the real mistaken for it. But what is the artwork, other than that last refuge, that last residue or vestige of synthesis between intellectual and manual labor? And this is why we all glorify, I think, ultimately, why culture and society holds the artwork on high. It's not necessarily because it's purposive purposelessness, as Kant argued, but it's because it holds open the space where intellectual and manual labor, so-called production or so-called creation and production, are still held in tension. And what, if anything, is the avant-garde but the prefiguration of new forms of social and political praxis? As such, it speaks to the relevance of a discursively overloaded avant-garde now, 100 years later. How has this avant-garde come to be yet again a toolkit, not an instrumentalization, for imagining new techniques of praxis at the level of social relations as well as of arts? So I'd like to conclude with some contemporary art that I think are picking up exactly these questions. Claire Fontaine, whose work I'm showing you, a collective artist group subject, directed the questions of media and of techne and technology into art praxis. Their reception of the ready-made casts it less as a set of static objects, as Jasper Johns, Yves Klein, and all the other blue chip dudes of art history had understood it, but rather as a nexus of social relations allegorized by ready-made objects. What preoccupies me about their work, just as I sense it preoccupied them, is the way in which the Duchampian ready-made comes to be situated as a technology formative of subjects. And this is why Claire Fontaine insists again and again that, quote, we are all ready-made artists. And what do they mean by that? They mean that creation and creativity is foreclosed by production and market transaction, but it's exactly that foreclosure that dialectically gives us the tools to overcome this kind of abstraction. So thank you for my long art historical talk, those of you who may not be so interested in art, and I welcome questions.
Thank you, Jaleh. I really enjoyed that, and it did what I hoped your presentation would do, which is just I think a tremendous erudition in terms of your discussion of these different sources, and this is, I think, really bringing us beyond potential narrower discussions about Sohn Rethel or the value form or things like this into a larger domain. Do we have any questions for Jaleh at this point? Any questions? Okay, 2 participants raised their hand. Just 1 second. Okay, we have Matt Browning raised his hand. Yeah. Is that Matt, would you like to ask a question? Matt, are you there? We also have Ali Heidi raised his hand. Maybe Ali, you'd like to ask a question?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Jaleh.
Hi. Nice
Great to see you. And thank you so much for this fabulous presentation. It was really refreshing. Specifically that I mean, I'm kind of like abusing this moment as I'm working on the subject in my dissertation. And Jaleh is my primary advisor. So I'm basically trying to ask a question before submitting the part and getting the comments from her institutionally. Well, I would like to ask this question. It's slightly outside the topic, but I think it's yet relevant. Recently, there was a polemic and debate between Alain Badiou and Reza Negarestani on the subject of artistic abstraction, in which they were both trying to make a distinctions between artistic abstraction and industrial abstraction and social abstraction, and more importantly, scientific abstraction. Badiou, and this thing is published, by the way, but in the book called Matter and Form, Self-Evidence and Surprise, which was a polemic on Jean-Luc Moulin's Objekt, which was an exhibition in Miguel Ebro, just for the sake of reference, in which Negarestani makes an axiom of what is an artistic abstraction, in which I'm basically quoting, and he says that the system of abstraction is the ambition of thought to liberate itself from the tyranny of the here and now. And here Badiou comes in and he says Negarestani is absolutely wrong, because abstraction, whatever the process of abstraction is, the artistic abstraction always ends up in the self-evidence of the object that is here and is here right now. So for Badiou, the abstraction is not in the resulting object, rather it's a process that's always outside the work. My question is, I think they're both equally wrong, because for Badiou, he says and it's really beautifully contradictory, because the subject of art for Badiou is always in the work of art. However, so it's in the resulting object, but the abstraction for Badiou is a process that is only for the artist. So it's not really having to do with the receiving end of art. When the third party or the spectator or the audience comes to meet this operation, using Rancière's terminology, the relations between the optical and the linguistic that exists in the image or in the sculpture. My question is that this account of abstraction that is defined around the axis of the here and now. For me, the very phenomenological account of here and now, which has to do with the perceptions of the object in the gallery space, or wherever the spatiotemporality of perception is, in and of itself has nothing to do with the logical account of here and now, which is a constant addressing to the there and then of the language. So here I'm going with some certains of structuralism that, for example, when we have the title of an artwork, and when we see an artwork, it always ends up in the linguistic formulation in our head, which belongs to the category of the already said. So even Badiou's account of here and now, which is an object that does not make sense, it's unnameable, it's an absence in the here and now. So for me, in the works of Picabia that you showed, there's a great way out of this impasse. For example, in that work of The Young Girl, the relationships between the title and the visible, it's such that whatever the visible economy and the optical economy is setting up, the linguistic economy is disorganizing. So we're seeing an industrial object whose title is The Portrait of a Young Girl. And to me, this is exactly what a real abstraction could be. So abstraction can no longer, in the contemporary sense of art, be that bully to the eye, that which is visibly nonsensical or insensible. Rather, it's this disorganization of the relationships between the optical and the linguistic, which is absolutely perfectly taking place in works of Picabia that you were showing. So sorry for this long location. I needed to locate my question by providing some context. I was wondering, what do you have to offer on this debate between Badiou and Negarestani, and my take on this account of here and now? So I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks so much for those comments and that question. So I would say that what Badiou is saying is more or less descriptive, and what Negarestani is saying is aspirational. It's the aspiration of the artwork, not necessarily what it always accomplishes. But I think the more important, or to me, what is very, very important about what you're currently saying is, as you say, both Badiou and Negarestani, we don't need to lean on either Negarestani or Badiou. And what I should have shown to illustrate the point you're making about the incommensurability between the object and the linguistic sign, I should have shown Marcel Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages, which is a spoof on any formalization, any metric, any measure, because here he's taking a meter-long piece of string and dropping it from a meter high and noting that the contingency of the real, which I think has been misunderstood in the post-war reception of the Duchampian ready-made, is this kind of anything goes sort of hocus pocus. I think that the contingency that he's noting there is an allegory for what you're saying, which is all that is lost. It's a kind of Bermuda Triangle between the viewer's reception, the object that is the artwork, and the linguistic sign, which is, I think, exactly that triangle that both Picabia and Duchamp wanted to occupy. And the reason I spend so much time in this paper sort of spinning my wheels on a meta level is to insist again and again and again that what the artwork gives us is a demonstration, or the closest approximation of a demonstration of how the concepts that Sohn Rethel is mobilizing, how they operate in everyday life, and why the work of art matters. So abstraction is saturated. It's everywhere, right? We can no more locate it than we can say, oh, there's air, or that's air, or this is air, right? It's absurd. It's a logical absurdity. So the artwork is there to kind of capture that problem, which is, I think you and I are stating the same problem, but I would say that the ultimate act of the artwork is to keep highlighting that problem, the incommensurability between the iconic sign, the indexical sign, the linguistic sign, in the move toward formalization that all of this theory and all these political economists are grasping toward. I think art does it better, in short, which is why Krauss and Lazzarato both call the ready-made the theoretical object par excellence, because it's thinking the problem of abstraction and the ways in which abstraction negates the traditional understanding of creation and creative agency. Does this begin to answer you?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think I'm getting it, because it's interesting. In the same book, Badiou is trying to denounce Duchamp as this basically absurd or basically saturated attempt to always keep art as at this level of synthesis between art as an object and art as a process. And to me, this is the locus of contradiction when Badiou comes to art. When he goes to politics, it's fabulous. When he comes to art, when he's talking about the subject of art, and for him, we know that the subject is never in a state of being, is always a process.
Mm-hmm.
He says the subject is in the work of art. But the abstraction, which is the drive behind the production for Badiou, he says it's only for the artist. So he's absolutely dismissing this other phenomenological thing, let's say spectator, when it comes to attend art. So this incommensurability between the optical and the linguistic, what does this do to that third party? So here is yet another possibility for abstraction, and artwork takes on this level of modality of thinking, as you said. So art becomes a mode of thinking. Mm-hmm. So he basically dismisses that. And I think your answer is really giving a way out to that.
Thanks. That's too bad, because in the pantheon of high French theory, Badiou is, to my lights, one of the better readers of the artwork. But I'll have to look into what you're saying. So if you send me the reference. And I see Matt is back on screen. Hi, Matt.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt. Ask.
Thanks. So this was a great talk, Jaleh. Thank you for it. And I like the relation of Heidegger to Sohn Rethel is surprising and interesting. I look forward to hearing more about that in the future. And I think I think the point that the value imperative is a type of intention, or it renders the question of intention moot at the subjective level, I think is very right on. And I agree, but I wanted to sort of I wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit on the distinctions between intention and reflection, or intention and self-consciousness, because if Sohn Rethel's division of intellectual manual labor, as you say, is the distinction between reflective labor and manual production, but if all production is guided by what C.D. Blanton says capital is, which is intention without consciousness, then there is there's a way in which the intention without consciousness that is capital legislates over all human action, but there is another way in which reflectivity or self-consciousness is reserved only for intellectual labor. And so for someone like Blanton, I think the problem is less a question of intention and more of a question of what intentions are running up against what intentions. What is the intention of something like MCM prime do to human intention? And what does the role of self-consciousness or reflexivity do to complicate what intention is at core, which is kind of a description of what he's using Lukács, like teleologically posited outcomes, outcomes with actions with outcomes in mind. And so is intention, I guess what it boils down to, is intention the primary problem, or is self-consciousness and reflection kind of a greater issue, especially when it comes to art, restoring some sort of humanity to production through the synthesis of manual and reflective labor?
Yeah, thank you. You raise a very interesting question, which is urging me to query the distinction among consciousness, intention, and self-reflexivity. That's what I hear you asking. And it's true, I might be collapsing those three. What I think is going on in Sohn Rethel's retort to Kantian epistemology is to, first of all, I will provisionally collapse those three: consciousness, intention, and self-reflexivity. I think what Sohn Rethel is saying is that those three aren't somehow preceding or anterior to transaction, which then negates them. Those three are themselves produced by a set of transactions that create those categories as such. So the kind of the initial division between intellectual and manual labor is necessitated by what can be packaged and exchanged as such without confusing it with everything else. But again, and I know I make the same mistake in all of my work, which is maybe a mistake, maybe not a mistake, I don't know. But I slip back into that constant Adornoian dialectic, which is that the point of the artwork is the last remaining reserve of the negative where these things can even be queried, which is what you're doing. So I think what the ready-made does, I think Peter Berger got it right when he says that the ready-made throws the question back onto the institutional framework. I think what he's missing there is that institutional framework is itself a function of a market. I think the point that in the most vulgar reductive sense, the point is that intention, consciousness, and reflexivity, none of those are actively possible unless they first account, unless they're really actively fighting against the way in which they were first forged as things to be traded at market. So what I think about the artwork is kind of the way that Badiou is describing the subject in theory of the subject, that what constitutes the subject isn't an automatic thing. The subject has to battle through all of these kinds of ready-made forms, which are concatenated in the unconscious through a historical process. This is Badiou's kind of impossible attempt to, for once and for all, make psychoanalysis and Marxist theory jive in a notion of the subject. So I would take what he's doing there and apply it to the artwork. That's the only place where you have some attempt at a holdout or a kind of fortress where the very notion of consciousness, agency, intention is opened up, despite the fact that that is made next to impossible by the gallery, the museum, the space of exhibition, which is really just setting a gold standard for the sale of the artwork. Does this begin to answer your question? What I need to do is go back and think about how consciousness and intention are different.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I really don't think that this is giving us a model of, or talking about false consciousness. I think it's, what it's doing is pointing out that the way we understand what our consciousness is already a function of a social synthesis that comes from the market. We either battle that or we blithely go along with it. That's a little reductive, but that's what I would return to.
Thank you.
Sure.
Nice. Okay. Okay, Arlen Austin has a question here. So I'm just gonna, is he already a panelist? Just let me double check. Yes, I believe so. So Arlen, if you can go ahead.
Hi, Arlen.
Am I unmuted? I think I'm unmuted. Yeah. Thanks, Jaleh. Extraordinarily brilliant talk. And, you know, I'm still trying to kind of digest many of your points. I mean, I think my question might relate to the two previous, particularly Ali's and the question of, you know, bluntly speaking, why it is that Lacanians can't talk about art very well. But you make this wonderfully provocative claim, right, that Lacan learned more from the Dadaists and Surrealists than he ever, you know, gave to them, which is, you know, you then sort of ran through cybernetics and a lot of other interesting kind of related questions. I guess my question would be to like maybe just ask you to clarify, maybe slightly push back on, you know, the relation between surplus value and surplus jouissance, which would be the the Lacanian claim, right? That there, the Lacanian sort of response to Sohn Rethel, for example, would be that, I'm stating it in the crudest possible fashion, but it would essentially be that, there was some moment at which, this surplus terrible enjoyment became possible, right? It wouldn't be the, the advent of coinage. I mean, Lacan is hilariously, crass and anti-historicist in this regard. He's like, I at some point when ships were circulating around Spain or something, suddenly this terrible pleasure becomes possible. And I love the way you used, like Lacan co-opting Dada and surrealism. I think that's really important. I'd just like you to clarify it more, and the relationship, this relationship between surplus pleasure, surplus value, obviously seems kind of essential to the argument. I found myself losing the thread a little bit. So I guess I'm just asking for more.
Yeah, that's really important. And you're kind of calling me out on a kind of what might seem a premature dismissal of Lacan, which isn't my intention. My intention is more to clarify what I think these artists are doing, which is to see the subject as scattered, as dispersed. Mm-hmm. And that which we take to be the subject is in fact a process along a set of stations. And I think that the one way I would answer this would be, it's already there in your question. An analogy between surplus jouissance and surplus value is kind of already relying on the degree to which the subject is being mapped along the circuits of production at all. So that it's already kind of there in your question. I think what talks like this do, and what they run the risk of doing, and I'm sure, I mentioned George Baker's research into the origin of Picabia's title. He's done a great deal of archival research in which he has clarified that yes, indeed, Picabia did indeed get the title from Marx. But if George were here right now in the audience, he would say that I am making the artwork, that I'm reducing it to being somehow illustrative of theory and not the other way around. So my point was simply to mitigate in advance that charge by saying that I think the two are both learning. Each is learning from the other, right? I'm not trying to reduce the work of art to theory. I'm saying the work of art is doing the labor of thinking, which only later is formalized in language, whatever the theory might be. And we know that Lacan spent a great deal of time with the surrealists. So I'm running the risk of mapping these things too cleanly onto one another, and that will never work in the final count. And I'm doing it strategically to sort of obviate the charge that, oh, I'm just making the work of art a mere illustration. I don't think surplus jouissance and surplus value ultimately map on one-to-one, despite the fact that the question would make it seem as though they could. And my point about Lacan is simply to say that I think he is the way in which he theorizes the subject as a set of moments strewn along a process, kind of like a looping figure eight, is very much indebted to the artwork. And I think that's what Badiou is trying to put an end to in Theory of the Subject by saying, yes, the subject is scattered, dispersed, but a certain moment comes where one crosses over from that, from being born an omelette, a kind of passive thing that is just a set of moments in circulation, to something that coheres as a resistant subject. I don't know where surplus jouissance comes in there. That's out of my depth. But thank you.
Thank you. No, that's a really informative answer, actually. I think that, you know, it's such a nuanced relation between the two. That, yeah,
They're mutually
kind of
independent.
impossible to
That's all my
answer,
point
but
is.
I think yeah, it's a brilliant approach. Yeah.
Thanks.
So are there other questions for Jaleh at this point? Anyone put up their hand? Panelists, attendees, anyone have any questions for Jaleh? Further questions? Okay, well, as I don't see anything, Jaleh, in spite of probably my tremendous underqualification to talk about, you know, modern art, I would maybe like to ask you a couple things. I was really, there's a couple things that really struck me in your presentation, and I thought it was interesting when you said that, you know, the romanticization of art in our era owes to the way that it, in a sense, you know, mystically, if not concretely, is capable of uniting or purports to unite or is perceived as uniting intellectual and manual labor. And I thought in a way that that's a remarkable, you know, as a Marxist, to say that that's a remarkable ambivalent formulation about art, which at the end you said, well, I think art does it better, right? Because of course, if it's responsible, you know, and in a way, in modern European bourgeois societies, you can see the extent to which art supplants religion in certain respects. You know, in a way,
101. Yeah, sorry.
yeah. In a way, if you you know, for it to perform this sort of mystical unification is also for it to be involved in the perpetuation of existing social relations. And I wonder, earlier I was talking sort of about the way that you know, I sort of use this determinant of Stalin, you know, proletarian science and bourgeois science. And, you know, I was talking about this reflexivity, right, that we can see with the category of labor, right, you know, potentially leaning toward its own self-dissolution, right, but also the way that science challenges sort of the formal axioms of commodity exchange, or it can, in a sense. And what I wonder is, you know, in terms of, I think a lot of what you were dealing with sort of dealt with, you know, the co-optation of some of these originary ambitions, right, that you're sort of outlining within art. I'm wondering, you know, how appropriate is the medium of art today in terms of being a medium for the representation of the way that the commodity structure affects social relations or affects thought in that way? Because it seems to me that one thing that's very common is that, you know, it's become, of course, we can talk about this sort of, you know, the influence of you know, popular advertising or media or processes of commerce upon art. A lot of people today do that, but in a way, I wonder if it's not a little bit like, you know, how Zizek describes ideology, right, functioning today. It's like, well, we know the thing, but we're still doing the thing, right? So this is kind of the question I'm asking you. Do you think that, you know, in the same way that, as I said, you know, labor perhaps has to abolish itself, the modern category of labor, I mean, in order to self-actualize, do you think that, in a way, this limit that's hit, in addition to all the material aspects we could describe, do you think it has to do with the limits of the formal medium of art? Or do you think that has to dissolve those strictures in order for that critique to be realized?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'll frame my answer through deference to Debord's Society of the Spectacle. I think it's either thesis 91 or 93, where he says Dada sought to overcome art without realizing it, and surrealism sought to realize art without overcoming it. The task is to do both. And I think one of the reasons that I'm continually trotting out the work of Claire Fontaine is their overly reflexive, aware attempt to do both, to realize art and thereby to overcome it, which is why they're always offering things that are overcoded as an artwork in an institution, but can easily be taken out of that context and potentially even used. So, you know, I showed you the passe-partout, which are a bunch of keys or a bunch of tools to be used in a variety, both to unlock conventional locks and, you know, maybe potentially to engage in hacking. And so what they're doing there is demonstrating for the umpteenth time a kind of hyper awareness of the impasse to which the work of art has come, the way that it's painted itself into a corner, but also the hope, without making it too overt, that someone will smash right through the frame, the pedestal, take it, do something with it. So, when their work was shown in California, I think somewhere in the Bay Area in 2011 or 12, the title of the work was something like Fire in the Nail Salon. And then somehow magically the art gallery was set on fire. And there was a lot of conjecture as to whether they had maybe done it, or they called for it, or they were responsible for it. So again, it's leaving open this tiny, tiny last vestige or sliver of indeterminacy. But the point is to both realize and overcome. So yes, the work of art would abolish itself as such, yes. In the same way, Thierry Communist's reading of Kapital, which I think ultimately is the right reading, that the point isn't to glorify the worker or work, the point is to overcome work as it's presently understood. I think their point is, yeah, the work of art has got to be abolished through its realization. Yeah.
And what I like too about the analogy with Thierry Communist, when we compare it with Jaleh or something like that, is that Thierry Communist looks for the abolition of what we could say the modern category of labor, but I think also demonstrates an acute sensitivity to the way that present day struggles feed into that, right? Rather than saying well, we're all just kind of subsumed and this doesn't count, and then there was 10 minutes after the Russian Revolution or whatever, right? So I think it's because we have to understand that I think in discrete ways, like the resistance to capital is something that manifests in every day of our lives, right? You can kind of glimpse it right all over in little ways, and maybe part of the function of art is to highlight that as well. But I want to pose a related question as well. I thought this was I hadn't thought about the relationship of early 20th century art to things like French structuralism or Lacan. So you're giving me a whole new point of view here. But I want to ask about a little bit about because you talked about this chance, right? Some kind of hope, right? When you're talking about the people setting the thing on fire. Sorry, I'm being a bit fogged in my recapitulation of your what you were saying, but what I mean is, I think here it's interesting because you said you wanted to talk a little bit about Badiou, and I wonder, it seems to me, in a way, that if we look at, Badiou, obviously, I think you could say very schematically that he's sort of fusing, the centrality of choice in Sartre with the structuralism of, someone like Althusser, also by way of Lacan and in opposition to post-structuralism. But it seems to me in a way that if we look at, sort of the Lacanian focus on sort of the math theme or the diagram, we can see something consistent here with structuralism. I mean, structuralism in France is emerging in this context in which capitalism is having like a powerful renewal, right? And in a way, I feel like, with the adaptation of these sort of formal and diagrammatic structures, the attempts to cultivate a science, as it were, in a way, it burrows itself within, forms of abstraction, which are, have been associated with the expansion of capital, right? And I think, in a way, with Badiou, he opposes, of course, post-structuralism, but it's interesting. I feel like in a way, like writing in the 80s and 90s, it's like the actual situation had become so terrible, right? In terms of, the state of socialism, the state of Marxism and so forth, that I feel like he kind of makes these abstractions innocent because he has to, right? In order to find some way of positing, right? Because we talked about this, right? Substance being permanent in time, right? To find a way of making congealing Marxism, kind of making it something eternal as well, right? And I was very, very struck when you talked about the way that labor is always concealed, right? And I wonder if, in a way, and I wonder, because I wonder if in a way, if you would agree with this, if you think that, the question now is also how to make labor visible again, right? How to move away from the position in which we're, kind of making abstraction more innocent than we should, in order to kind of stow Marxism there, kind of freeze it like Dr. Evil going to the future or something.
Mhm.
And whether you would agree that the question is now how to make labor visible. What do you think about that?
What do I think about that? I think maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, or I'm reducing it. What I think about that is that's one of the most imperative, intensively urgent issues of the moment. So, okay. Because during the pandemic, everyone was learning new skills and all this kind of stuff, I figured I needed to make myself useful, do something with myself. Besides, I don't care about baking bread and cooking, whatever. So I went and I reread Kapital and I reread Grundrisse. And then I put myself through David Harvey's online tutorials, right? So, the big debate between Harvey and Brenner wants to locate the kind of inevitable collapse of capitalism in this kind of interpretive kernel. He is to Marxism what an originalist would be to the Constitution, right? He wants to see everything in Marx's kind of what he takes or what he turns into a dogma of the law of the tendency of profit to fall, whereas Harvey wants to see everything in under globalization as the invisible but ultimately connected relations of seemingly autonomous parts in a moving totality. And one of the problems Harvey locates is why why the kind of Marxist analysis ended up withering away and post-structuralism took over, is that's a lot of that's tracking parallel to the capital flight from the former core to what I called in my brief intro, the global South, right? All these underpaid workers in Bangladesh and Bangalore and Manila, keeping these servers up and running. That is exactly the problem. The exact problem is the invisibility of labor that leads all of us in the privileged global North to be going on and on at these conferences without any tangible sense of the worker, of labor, or of the proletariat, because it's been placed out of sight, out of mind in our life world. So yes, the absolute problem is to make labor visible, because we all seem to think that we have historically moved past labor as the driving force of the metabolic of everyday life, and that now things are just relying on, right, debt or finance capital or technology. No, the point is that the labor is congealed in all of this and is obfuscated, overwritten, and made invisible. That's what abstraction is. And yeah, the point is for it to show itself. So all I can say in answer to your question is yes, I absolutely agree. And I also think that the entirety of the avant-garde is, you would have no avant-garde without proletarianization and without the Marxist analysis of the proletariat. That the point of the artwork taking the invisible and making it visible isn't some mystified quasi-religious thing about making God manifest or something. It's about making manifest the social relations that have become mystified and invisible in everyday life. So my answer to you is yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to say that's exactly, I realized the question maybe sounded very general, but it's actually very, very complicated. I figured, of course, you'd say, yes, it's important to expose labor, right? But you see, there's sort of a crisis of mapping, not just labor, not just in terms of the transformations that have occurred with it, in the West, which might lead, kind of leads Negri to sort of throw in the towel and just say, well, the labor theory of value, law of value is everything is value, which seems like a very schematic way of answering that. But also with respect to, as you said, the third world and the invisibility of that. So it's a very complex issue, right? How to make it visible. I understand now we have.
Just a word to that, and I
Sure.
know, I mean, I'll lean on Arlen, and I know there's another question. I think, and I've argued this at length in other published work, again, through works of art, I think Negri and Hart's coinage of the term multitude is to some extent a kind of a cop-out and a little bit vague and flabby and unspecific, because they didn't, or Negri wasn't really paying attention to, for instance, the analysis of the Italian feminists, Fortunati, Della Costa, Federici, et cetera, who all are very important to the formation of Clairefontaine. One of the members of Clairefontaine studied with Della Costa, et cetera. Just because labor is no longer embodied in the robust figure of the laborer in the kind of industrial arena doesn't mean that labor is still not an issue, still not a problem in class formation, doesn't need some form of visibility, et cetera, et cetera. So I just, on this one point, Negri's great, but I think he's kind of wrong in just dispersing class and labor and the question of the proletariat into a generalized multitude. I just don't think so.
Totally agreed with that.
Just make a quick point corroborating Jaleh's point on regarding your question, Conrad. I'm so sorry. I think, Conrad, you're right that Badiou is trying to kind of like make an alignment between structuralism and the legacy of Sartre. But I'm afraid, I think you're wrong that he's doing that by way of Althusser. So I think Badiou needs to be read quite precisely, not hastily. And he makes this great point in one of the greatest works of philosophy of the 20th century, Logics of Worlds, that the problem of Althusser and post-structuralists in altogether is that like they take this scientific road way too much to the point of eliminating the subject altogether. And there is no such a thing as political resistance without subject. So for Badiou, the problem, however, that he raises, and I think Jaleh raises fantastically, is that like a theory of the subject at the end of the day cannot be a theory of the object. The content subject, phenomenological subject, a structure, post-structuralist subject, these are at the end of the day a bunch of objects, very particular objects in the world. And for Badiou, the labor, he makes a yet new reading of the labor, and he names it the generic particularities that are on the margins of the encyclopedic zone of the world. Call it refugee, call it Black, call it Palestinian, call it whatever you want. So that's why nothing out of the fabric of identity politics comes out of Badiou. Nothing out of like identitarian practices comes out of Badiou. And that's all because of making labor visible again. So we cannot simply jump over Badiou by saying that, yeah, he does that, but he makes the abstraction innocent by turning toward post-structuralism. No, he does not do that. And that's why he's not quite popular, because at the end of the day, Badiou, with the cancel culture, with the identity politics, with all this, that, like no one really holds Badiou. He's an old-fashioned Christian for that. So he does that by subject, and the subject for Badiou is not a human being. Is a process that the human being gets to enter and keeps the fidelity to it. And this is really hard and at the same time easy to be understood. I think with that, we can understand what is Badiou doing. Sorry.
I agree with almost everything you said. And in case that wasn't clear, I meant pitting those things against the dominant post-structuralism. I didn't mean to say that he's using post-structuralism. So I accept everything you said. Okay, so now we have a few more questions. I understand that Eileen has a question here. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Jaleh. I have a question. So before your talk, I used to think that technology, it's something that could create labor. So I'm still thinking about my questions. Not sure if it's a correct one, but I was thinking about your statement about how labor is technology, and it's made me to think about this relationship as a cultural technique. On the other hand, I was also thinking about form, the way that Levine's define it, about the relationship between form and politics. And I'm wondering how the form can also dictate the labor. for a form to be understood, for a code to be unfolded and be understood and legible.
Yeah. So if you'd like me to speak to that, my point is that the reason that these artists pick up the forms they pick up is an acknowledgement of the historical emergence of labor as something that can be congealed in the object in the way that it is. So I think we're going in circles, but my point is that artists don't talk about social conditions and social relations through the means, the forms, the methods of prior moments of social organization. They pick up the forms that express best the social relations of the moment, which is why I think Duchamp picks up the ready-made and why Picabia picks up the diagram. Those are both overt and covert recognition that is the historical mode of production at that time, and that only form can express that. You can't go on and on talking about the proletariat. You enter into the structures that have been imposed on the proletariat that make the proletariat, which is what I think is going on in Degas' Little Dancer of 14 from 1881, that he's making those modes of production clash in order to articulate changing, whether consciously or unconsciously, changing historical conditions, right? The artisanal form of the lost wax process and figurative sculpture in bronze is obsolete, not because we want to be trendy or fashionable, but because at the most basic level of a metabolic between man and nature, the form of the metabolic has changed, and therefore the form of expression will change, which is exactly what, Benjamin says in his preface to the work of Art in the Age of its Technological Reproducibility, which is basically just paraphrasing Marx in the Grundrisse, where he talks about how the modes of expression and articulation are going to track parallel with the metabolic between man and nature at any given point. So I'm hoping that I'm answering your question. But yes, you have understood me correctly in that I'm saying that technology isn't just something that is born from the brains of brilliant engineers. Technology also is congealed living labor that has come to be sort of shelved and accumulated over time in ways that make technology possible. And I'm just, none of this is me. I'm just wrapping off of Marx in the Grundrisse, where he talks about the relationship between living labor and fixed capital. And fixed capital isn't just something that someone invented or that came out of Zeus's head. That itself is the accumulation of living labor over time that has passed over into dead labor that is congealed in the thing. Hence my discussion of Heidegger and the notion of being set to standing reserve. What is set to standing reserve is labor. So I hope that's answering you. I hope I'm not confusing myself.
Yes, thank you.
I think Howard has had his hand up for a very long time.
Yeah, we'll go to Howard now. Yeah, Howard.
Okay, this goes back to the question of the unity of intellectual and manual labor. And in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, there's a reference a couple of times to a sensuous consciousness. And I wondered if you would connect those at all. I'll read the passages.
Yeah.
One is the sensuous consciousness is not abstractly sensuous consciousness, but humanly sensuous consciousness. And then there's a little bit, therefore, only the way to true human reality. And then another passage is sense perception must be the basis of all science. Only when science starts out from sense perception in the dual form of sensuous consciousness and sensuous need is it real science. That, in other words, how, would you make that bridge between those two?
Yeah, I think what is being said there about science is why it's not that the work of art or that artists are claiming that they are, or some artists do. I mean, within the avant-garde, you have the kind of recursive trope of the laboratory. The Soviet constructivists thought that they were working in a laboratory, and in that laboratory, they would think about new forms to match the new subject. So what you're reading there about science is why I think our culture valorizes, and I'm using the word valorize incorrectly there. I don't mean in terms of the market realization of value. Why we make the work of art important is that it's the last holdout of sensuous thinking. It's making thinking rather than what is a kind of primary and incredibly violent divide between intellectual and manual labor. So I guess my answer to your question is to say, yes, that is what the work of art does and why it's still put on a pedestal, because there are very, very few places in our culture and society where intellectual and manual labor can still come together. I don't know if that's answering you.
Maybe without the text as such, just what you would think, in other words, getting beyond intellectual and manual labor to a sensuous consciousness, what would that mean?
Well, I think that's what the artwork purports to do.
Okay, good.
I think that's, and I think in Hegel's philosophy of fine art, so, okay, we know Marx. I think what Sohn Rethel is doing, Sohn Rethel is to Kant what Marx is to Hegel, right? Taking the dialectic and saying it can't just be a matter of ideology, by which he means just thinking. It has to be put on its feet in everyday space and made to act in a particular way. I think what Sohn Rethel is doing is querying the Kant's epistemological categories, but trying to make them a function of the social sphere, trying to say that these categories are situated in social space. But I think the reason that the work of art is so, why we put so much faith and stock into art isn't just because it's the kind of the historical inheritor of mysticism or the shaman, which is what Benjamin actually suggests in the work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility, is that this last residue of the shaman is still there in this kind of in the artwork, which is kind of like the use value of the absolute. It's kind of like use value on sabbatical or something like that. I think the reason that artwork continues to be so important to our culture, no matter how much we critique it or have problems with it or say that we need to abolish it, which we do need to abolish it as a category. But at the end of the day, it continues to be collectively valuable to us because of the way that it is sensual thinking. It is an attempt to overcome that kind of violent primary chasm that is imposed very early on us, on consciousness.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for an absolutely wonderful presentation, Jaleh.
Mhm.